Attention startup leaders. Are you strapped for time but hungry for strategic insights? Introducing Managed Chaos, your go-to podcast for navigating the startup world in less time than your morning commute. Join us as we share expert advice, real-world examples, and actionable strategies to help you scale your business, allocate resources effectively, and achieve visionary results. Tune into Managed Chaos and join a community of like-minded innovators on the path to entrepreneurial success.
The right culture for organizations can sometimes feel elusive. And in some cases, who even has the time to build culture when you need to be building a product? Welcome to Managed Chaos Podcast, where we give you the startup business rundown in less time than it takes for you to get to work. I'm Rachel Anderson.
And I'm Katrina Purcell.
And today we are talking about building the right culture. So let's start with the basics. What is organizational culture?
So first I'll tell you what it's not. It's not beer on tap and ping pong tables.
Are you sure?
Which I think for a long time, that's what people thought. It's not necessarily even about employee appreciation. It's actually really more about the beliefs and the values that are guiding your organization. So what rules and systems are you putting in place that create a framework for the people who work in your organization to understand how to make decisions, how to communicate about those decisions, how to disagree with those decisions, and then also how to bring their ideas forward. So it's really about a framework and how do you communicate that and how you document that, not necessarily about just making everybody happy and giving people Fridays off and having fun parties. And I think that's been somewhat of a common misconception.
Yeah. And, it's interesting because I think even the nature of business has created the idea of organizational culture. So if we think back pre the internet to how business was structured, you often had these longevity of career, 40 plus years at one place. And the culture of business was an industry culture usually, where you had this relationship with your employees. You stayed for a long time. There was this actual appreciation because you got to know people. And with the expansion of businesses in general, because of the way that the internet has accelerated growth and given us farther reach for people in completely different communities and ideas and places, I think that this is sort of a new concept. I think that we just assume that organizational culture is something that's always existed. And I think that this is really an important place to start, is just defining what it is, because I think that we don't typically think about that anymore. And then really acknowledging that it is not employee appreciation, which I love that you said that, because you're right. Absolutely.
Which is totally separate and should still be done, by the way, and should be part of your organization, but just it's not the culture itself.
Yeah, absolutely. So how are you able to scale culture then? As a team grows, it might be remote. That's so tricky. And I know a lot of leaders really grapple with, how do I keep this culture once I've established it? I have this dream, this vision, but now my company is growing, which I also want. I don't want to lose that culture.
I think the biggest thing there is that when you first start a company, you're generally pretty small. So it's probably you and a few people. And there's no reason to necessarily write down the culture, those beliefs, right? Those rules, that structure, because there's so few of you, it would be a waste of time. You all just have an understanding. And as you grow, that understanding becomes a game of telephone, where someone is training a new person on their team and they sort of fill them in on how they navigate the culture. And then slowly over time, that culture erodes because there's no paper, there's no, even internal site to go back to where you can see it. And where I've seen this happen is in organizations that are doing pretty aggressive hiring. So I was working with a startup and they wanted to bring on 30 new people in 1 year. That's a lot of people. And they were all across the globe. And what we started to think about first was less about the actual hiring of the people and more about what was their experience once they were hired. How did we introduce them to the company? What type of trainings were we giving them? What type of background about the company were we giving them? Because they were coming into a company that was going to be pretty different than the company that others had been working at. And then also, how do you bring the people along who had been there for the whole ride, right? And seen everything from the very beginning. And a lot of that really started behind documents. documenting it, right? And understanding how did the different offices navigate culture. So, we, in that particular startup, had offices in 4 countries. And a lot of those countries had very different customs. And I think sometimes people don't really take that into consideration. Holidays or events, things in the US that are just acceptable practice might not be in some other countries. And so navigating how you're going to handle that is definitely something that new hires are going to ask about and want to feel like they understand what the CEO thinks, but then also what the company's stance is on that. And so it's really all about investing in it, maintaining it, making sure that when you're hiring folks, you're not just looking necessarily for a culture fit, but a culture add. You don't want to just bring in all the same people. It's you're not going to get the best products that way. You're not going to get the best thoughts that way. You want to find people who are going to, sort of add to your culture. They're going to understand the rules. They're going to get those core tenets. They get them during onboarding. They're going to get them during the interview process. And they're going to feel like, okay, this is a place where I can grow.
You've just said so many incredible things that I have like 3 different thoughts at the same time. But it's interesting because I have seen a lot, and I was just having this conversation with someone yesterday, but I've seen a lot in hiring, especially early on, this idea of culture fit hiring. So I just want to touch on that piece that you said a little bit, which is that, it is okay at first to hire for culture. It's really important to weave the fabric of your business, the social things that you stand for, the emotional components of how you relate to others, or if you don't want to say emotional, that interpersonal connectivity, right? Like that does in fact make a huge impact on how your business grows. So I don't think that there's a de-emphasis on that. But I think you also touched on a really important thing, which is essentially diversity in hiring. And that's not always the traditional way that we think about diversity. That's diversity of thought. That's diversity of experience. That's diversity of maybe even like the skills that you bring to the table, right? You want that complementary aspect. And so as you start to grow, I said that there's sort of this crisscross where you start with culture fit, but the bigger you get, the more you need to hire for diversity of thought so that you really have a way to weave that together and you really can round out your team. But you said something really important at the end that I think is a perfect punctuation on that, which is that it only matters if you have it documented and you repeat it. It's something that is constantly reinforced as a culture, as a value, as a behavior. So I don't know. What do you think? Because we didn't really talk about this in advance. This is sort of me just like, oh, interesting thoughts.
No, I completely agree. And I think there's also this element, culture fit. There could be certain aspects of your culture that someone has to have, right? So, in those early days, they might have to have the ability to jump in and roll up their sleeves. And even if they're a manager, to be able to be hands on keys. And that's a non-negotiable. But maybe there are other aspects where you can kind of flex if you get the right candidate, right? And so I think it's also that the culture itself doesn't have to be one size fits all. There can be pieces of the culture where you can find someone that fits it and then that they can, add in other spaces.
I love that. So, I think culture in general can be tricky sometimes, figuring out what it is for you, deciding if you're a fit, if you're trying to get hired in somewhere, things like that. So what are some ways that you've seen that are ways to correct a cultural misstep?
So this one is a tricky one, and it requires a lot of humility. We call them, in some cases, we call folks culture killers, right? So you may have someone who's doing great work. They've been with you forever. They have all the institutional knowledge, but they haven't scaled and grown with your company, and they're bringing everyone else down. And you have to start to be able to evaluate and make some tough decisions. And in some cases, culture killers are actually, folks that kind of have to go. And it's really an age-old thing for me in the startup world where it could be they just really prefer to work at startups of a certain size at a certain stage. And you've just grown to the point that it's not fun for them anymore, but they've spent and invested so much time that they're having trouble making that decision. And that's okay. And as a leader, I think the best thing you can do for those folks is help coach and counsel them through that. Because if someone doesn't want to work at the stage of company that you're at now, they might be bringing others down with them. And you might need to be the person who kind of helps them to see that. The other type of misstep would be, as a leader, if you do not acknowledge, or you do acknowledge in a bad way, an incident or something that's happened, right? And so I think this is why you need to lean very heavily on your advisors, ensuring that you have someone from an HR capacity, someone from a communications capacity that can help you to communicate with your team in a way that resonates with them. And personally, I'm a big fan of apologies. I think you should actually feel sorry when you say it. It shouldn't just be a pro forma, oh, I'm sorry that you guys all took what I said wrong. It has to be what I said was wrong, or I should have approached it a different way. This happened at a startup that I was at when announcing some bad news. The bad news got announced in a way that just was not conducive to folks even hearing it. And, I think you have to be able to, as a leader, say, I'm really sorry, I screwed up. And I should have, come to you with better information. I should have come to you earlier and told you I was, trying to solve the problem before it became a bigger problem. And in doing so, I didn't let you know about the problem until right before it happened. And, I think people just want honesty. And I think that in a lot of cultures, there's this concept of, oh, I shouldn't tell anyone anything bad. When in reality, if you bring your team along, they can help you solution, or they at least knowing they can plan their lives if it's going to affect them.
I really love that. I think as leaders, we feel a lot of pressure to always have it together or always have the right answers. And it's just not true. We're just too human to be that. And so I love that that's kind of the final advice, because it's one of my 4 pillars whenever I work with teams. My personal values is that I will say I'm sorry, and I expect other people to also be able to do that. And there's such an incredible trust and vulnerability that can be built, which also ends up being bottom line for the business. That means customer retention. That means safety for new ideas, or even warnings about things that may be going wrong. So I love those. I love those advice pieces that you just gave. Culture is not only about employee appreciation. Rapidly hiring can also mean needing to invest in advance in maintaining that culture. And then finally, be aware of culture killers. So this was a great episode about creating the right culture for your business as you grow. Thanks for joining us today on Managed Chaos, and we will definitely see you next time.
This was another informative episode of Managed Chaos, the podcast for startups. You can find us on all of your favorite podcasting apps, as well as on Instagram and YouTube, where we are at Managed Chaos Podcast. For additional resources or to continue the conversation, you can find Katrina Purcell and Rachel Anderson on LinkedIn.